We're going to go ahead and get started on schedule as close as possible. I'd like to introduce everybody that will be speaking for the next approximately hour and a half. My name is Torres, and I kind of started the book project part of the Coyame story here in the U.S. And here to my right is my good friend and co-author Ruben Uriarte, who is from the Oakland Bay Area of California. We did most of the work on the first book using email, Dropbox, Facebook, all those wonderful technology tools. And then the gentleman who really did the serious behind-the-scenes work, without which our books could not have been written. I'd like to introduce Mr. Gilberto Rivera from Chihuahua, and also the country's leading UFO, civilian UFO investigator from Mexico, Mr. Carlos Guzman. And Carlos flew all the way from Mexico City at his own expense to be with us, and we are just completely thrilled. And we wanted to reimburse him somehow, but since this is a city-sponsored event and he's not a U.S. citizen, we ran into some issues there. So we are so thankful that they were both able to join us. And they'll be speaking to you during the course of our presentation. Ruben, do you have a few words before we get started on how our adventure has...
We'll be going into the presentation very shortly, but again, I'd like to thank Mr. Brad Newton and the rest of the city staff and the other volunteers for all the hard work they've done in putting this together. This is our second annual event, and through cooperation with Brad and working with Noe, the vision was to create a festival here that will focus on a unique event that happened just about 45 miles from here. And in our ventures that we've done together with Noe and I, we worked with these gentlemen here. But also we discovered, what we found out was there was a number of UFO sightings that I'm sure many of you have heard, and some of you have experienced. And what we realized in the theme of this event is called UFOs Have No Borders. They don't discriminate. It's the U.S., Mexico, or the rest of the world. And in that, we're just been in contact and networking with a number of key people, very interesting cases, and this is a worldwide phenomenon. So what we've done is this has been a collaborative effort. And so, with the focus from Mr. Brad and of developing this festival, what we're trying to bring to you is to give you as much information of not what's only going on in the world, but what's happening in your backyard as well. So thank you very much. And again, we're really pleased to have our lineup of speakers that have been with us. And with the program, we'll continue right after us, of course, with more interesting information. Thank you.
We're going to let the room cool down a little bit more, and then we'll be turning off the blowers because they get really loud. Hopefully we'll maintain a good level of comfort in here. We're going to take you back in time to how the entire Coyame story first came out to the world. Since this report that I'm about to show you came out, this UFO incident that happened close by here has been covered on numerous other documentaries, TV shows. As recently as this year, there was a program called Contacto Extraterrestre, which was done by the Spanish version of the History Channel, Canal de la Historia. So, but it all began with the History Channel contacting Ruben Uriarte, California, and telling him, you know, we heard about this story that there was a mid-air crash between a plane and a UFO along the Texas-Mexico border, and we'd like to do a documentary about it. And so Ruben, back in 2005, was the one that blew the lid off this case. And this was the original report. Just to give everybody background in case you haven't seen it, this is a 6-minute segment from the original documentary. And you'll see younger Ruben. He'll be transported back in time.
August 25th, 1974. Coyame, Mexico is home to its own mysterious, some say lethal UFO incident. It is a place not found on many maps, and is home to more agave plants than people. But several of those who do live here claim the following event is real. It's a quiet summer's night in Coyame. The town's inhabitants are beginning to turn into the night. 500 miles away, United States air defense systems suddenly registered an unknown object flying over the Gulf of Mexico, streaking across the sky at over 2,500 miles per hour at an altitude of 75,000 feet. Only one thing is for certain: this is not something man-made. Initial indications are that it's probably nothing more than a year. But 60 seconds later, it becomes clear that's impossible.
This object was traveling and descending through steps, unlike that of a meteor again, with more of an arc.
The object appears headed on a course towards Corpus Christi, Texas. American air defense systems are alerted. Suddenly, the unidentified flying object veers left and enters Mexican airspace, just 40 miles south of Brownsville, Texas. The U.S. continues tracking the puzzling spacecraft as it now races over Mexico. What isn't seen on radar is a small craft headed on a trajectory towards the UFO.
What's also interesting about this case is about the same time as this UFO was zigging and zagging, there was a plane that was leaving El Paso headed towards Mexico City.
As soon as the plane from El Paso heads toward Mexico's capital city, but never reaches its destination. At the same time, the American military watches as the unidentified flying object disappears from radar. It appears that the unthinkable has happened.
There's an assumption that there was a collision some night where both the craft and the plane had collided.
The following morning, 9 hours after the civilian plane disappeared over the desert, a Mexican recovery team hunts for the downed craft. Across the border, American intelligence listens in. The Americans intercept a Mexican military radio report. The wreckage of the missing planes is spotted just outside Coyame. Moments later, another report shockingly announces the sighting of a second plane. But this is no plane.
The Mexican recovery team finds a sort of a silver-shaped plastic disc, some 16 feet 5 inches, about 5 feet thick, convex on both sides, sort of like a saucer.
The saucer surface has the appearance of polished steel. It has no markings, no lights, and there are no bodies inside. However, it does appear to be damaged in 2 spots, possibly caused by a collision with a civilian plane, and then falling to the ground. Immediately, Mexican officials declared radio silence on all search activities. Meanwhile, U.S. officials reached out to the Mexican government, offering assistance in the recovery. Their offer is met with a denial.
The Mexican government denied it. They said, no, all we have is just a plane wreckage.
While the Mexican team collects the crushed debris, the United States is busy assembling their own elite recovery force at Fort Worth, Texas. The team includes 4 helicopters, 3 small units, and a large sea stallion. The team is on standby while U.S. surveillance scopes out the situation.
The U.S. was keeping tabs again through its spy, or what I call the spy surveillance network, through your satellite surveillance as well as airplanes that were flying over at low altitude.
American surveillance reveals that the Mexicans had placed a UFO on a flatbed truck and moved from the crash site. As I'm saying, satellite photos were taken that revealed a startling discovery. The Mexican convoy stopped. Something's wrong. We were able to see there were a number of dead bodies, which led them to believe that something extraordinary had happened. U.S. officials greenlight their rescue team. 4 helicopters depart forthwith.
One of the things that seems obvious in this case is that the government of the U.S. responded very expertly, very quickly, and very organized. This team is sent to Fort Lewis, and in no time we're down there on site recovering this. They've done this before.
Preparing Americans for what they were about to find. Dressed in bioprotection suits, the American soldiers approached the silent convoy and find all the Mexicans dead. There was no time to investigate what killed the Mexican team, but UFO researchers have their theories.
They somehow came in contact with a lethal agent, a bacteriological agent that was from out of this world, or an extraterrestrial biological agent of some sort that killed them, which is my favorite theory.
The U.S. recovery team quickly tends to business. They find a 16-foot wide silver UFO strapped to the back of a flatbed truck. The straps are reconfigured and connected to a cargo cable from the Sea Stallion helicopter. Safety secured. The estimated 1,500-pound disc has been produced and back to the U.S. When the saucer gone, the team immediately turned their attention to the remaining evidence. The plane wreckage, vehicles from the convoy, and Mexican team bodies are gathered.
They gathered the debris, the bodies from the Mexican recovery team, and then they exploded them with high explosives. The reason why is to hide evidence.
They were done. The recovery team headed back to base. Where the UFO was taken is unknown. Some have speculated it landed, Fort Bliss, or Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In this 1974 UFO crash reveal, there was no evidence to prove it.
Okay, so that kind of gives you an overview of what happened, and we're going to more closely break down the events. We have been down to the Coyame area and the site where this happened a number of times, and we've wandered around the desert looking for evidence, looking for traces. And when we went with the History Channel for the UFO Hunters show a couple of years ago, we did one of the first, it was one of the first episodes there, right? Yes. We made some significant, what we felt were some significant findings, which we're going to share with you. And we talked to a lot of witnesses in the Coyame area who have witnessed paranormal events. And in talking to our fellow investigators, Carlos and Gilberto, and others, they report, they say that there are a lot of reports of UFO sightings and other paranormal activity in that area. So we'll be discussing that more. So everything started with this sighting of an object coming in toward the Texas coast, roughly inbound to Corpus Christi, at a very high rate of speed. It was a silver disc-shaped object that was later described. And it was at first going about 2,500 miles per hour at an altitude about 75,000 feet. But it started slowing down and dropping in altitude, made a 90-degree angle turn just south of the tip of Texas, and it came across into Mexican airspace just about 40 or 50 miles south of Brownsville, Texas, which is near my home. I live in the McAllen area. And so the object then streaked across northern Mexico, and eventually, as you already know from what we've mentioned and shown, it came into collision with a small plane that had left about 30 to 45 minutes earlier from El Paso Airport. And the plane was headed toward Mexico City, but it was following a flight path that took it down along here. And then it was right at about this point that the mid-air collision occurred. And guys, feel free to jump in at any time. Si gustan decir algo, nomás me hacen un señal. Just for a point of reference, military radar installations in 1974 along the Texas coast are listed here. We had Lackland Air Force Base, of course, San Antonio, Oilton FAA, and Ellington AFB. So we had radar coverage out into the Gulf fairly well covered. So when this object appeared to have dropped down out of the Earth's atmosphere, there was a high level of concern that it could be an ICBM that had been fired at us by the Russians at that time. We were still in the Cold War period. So here is roughly the track that we're talking about that was followed. It suddenly appeared in the Gulf, heading toward Corpus Christi, then took more or less of a south-southwesterly track, and then made this extreme angle change, while still going well over 2,000 miles per hour, by the way, into Mexico. You know, some of the folks that have investigated this case have noted that it seemed to be avoiding any large population centers and stayed mostly over sparsely populated areas. So that's something that's been noted. Also, people have asked us, well, where could it have been headed if it hadn't crashed here in the, near Presidio in the Coyame area? Some people have speculated that maybe it was headed toward Nevada or the Area 51 base. So I don't know, this is just speculation, of course. We don't know what its ultimate or intended destination might have been. So as I mentioned, there was a small plane that had left El Paso about 9:30 Texas time. And we believe that the collision occurred at about 10:30, roughly, just giving you rough approximations of the time. And X marks the spot where this occurred. The radar blip suddenly disappeared. They were tracking both craft. Suddenly, there was no track for either. So at that point, there arose a suspicion, as Ruben said in the video that we just watched, there arose a suspicion that a mid-air collision had occurred. Just to set the stage geographically where this occurred, we are currently here in Presidio, Texas. Here is Candelaria, very small little community just north of here. The area of the crash, here is Coyame, the actual small town of Coyame. This whole area is also called Coyame. It's the municipio de Coyame, what we would call a county. They refer to as a municipio. So when people call this the Coyame incident, they're making reference primarily to the municipio, or the territory of Coyame. And so The crash occurred, the mid-air collision occurred somewhere in the shaded area. Ruben, feel free to step in at any time and give your color commentary. You can be the tech summary.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. Great job as always. Joey put together this fabulous map and all the graphics. And one of the things, the way we learned through this, we received a document called the Denham Report. It was a document that was issued or sent anonymously to a number of well-known UFO investigators back in the 1990s. And it was very detailed. It was a report that was written by either, number one, a person that was very much involved in this operation, two, that had military background, or was involved with a group of other service people that were very, very much involved in this particular case. And when Noe had contacted me, Noe had already was looking at the Denham report, and we both evaluated. Noe, being from Texas, was very familiar with the southwest of the Big Bend National area. He says, you know what, Ruben? He says, the people that wrote this report really know geographically Texas. And so, based on the report, we were able to do our detective work and come up with this particular hypnosis. Lose for words. Pardon? Hypothesis. That's it, yeah. I just turned 29 yesterday. So anyway, in looking at all the geographic area, this is as we were able to come up and look at all the specific areas. And so as we go further into the PowerPoint, you'll see about how all the pieces come together. And in addition to that, the latest new information that we want to share. Okay.
We're going to ask Mr. Gilberto Rivera, who is essentially the top UFO investigator for the state of Chihuahua, and he happens to also work for the tourism department in Chihuahua City. And he's going to set the scene for you as to where this area, what this area is like in Mexico. He's been out there doing the investigation on the Mexican side. So he's going to talk, and I'm going to translate as best we can.
Bien, buenas tardes a todos ustedes.
Good afternoon.
El área es muy interesante,
This is a very interesting area,
ya que se encuentra tal vez a unos 80 kilómetros de Coyame, donde se ve el punto donde pudo haber impactado
It's about 80 kilometers from the small community of Coyame.
la avioneta con el ovni que entró desde el Golfo de México, un ovni discoidal
And this is where we suspect that the mid-air collision occurred.
entre 6 o 7 metros de diámetro. Se impacta con la avioneta y cae en pleno desierto.
That's where the crash occurred, and the craft, the object, which almost intact, still in an almost intact condition, fell to the desert floor below. And he also noted that it was a rather small object in terms of its width.
Aquí lo interesante es que los lugares aledaños al impacto son ranchos, no hay población. La población importante es la ciudad de Coyame.
It's very important to note that this is a ranching area, very sparsely populated, and the nearest population center as such is the small community of Coyame. But out in that area that you see on the map, these are all ranches. You don't have people, you don't have a permanent residents. There aren't permanent residents of this area. People go out there to work on their ranches, and then they go back to Coyame or one of the other cities.
Lo interesante es de que en los ranchos, los dueños, existen algunos testigos, dueños de los ranchos, que afirman haber estado en ese lugar en el momento en que se produjo el impacto. Hay algunos testimonios históricos
I have talked to a number of individuals who lived there in 1974 and who have testified to being present at the time that this event happened and having experienced the impact and the effects of the blast and the impact when this collision occurred.
Las personas tienen más de 60 años de edad. El incidente fue el 25 de agosto de 1974.
Of course, most of the witnesses are now 60 years of age or older, since this happened back in August 25, 1974.
Esta zona ha habido intervención militar, ha habido otros impactos. Incluso Noé Torres y Ruben Uriarte en su primer libro hablan de un impacto de un misil balístico Pershing el mes de septiembre de 1967 en una zona similar a donde se impacta el ovni de Coyame, lo que ha causado alguna confusión entre los pobladores.
There have been, and it's important to note, Gilberto points out that there were several missile crashes, which are covered in our book, Mexico's Roswell. We did the research on finding out about U.S. missile crashes which occurred in this general area in other years. And so Gilbert is saying that when we're conducting research on the 1974 event, sometimes the local villagers and the local residents get confused, and they might be making reference to one of the missile crashes, such as the Athena crash. ¿Qué año fue el Athena?
1967.
1967, an Athena missile crashed kind of north of this area we're talking about, farther north. Correction on that, 1970. Well, there was a crash in 67. I'm just not completely certain without looking at the reference materials. Anyway, go ahead.
Brevemente, se tiene dentro del documento que se clasificó vía internet, el documento TENET, que una avioneta sale de la ciudad del Paso, Texas, con rumbo a la Ciudad de México, City.
So the crash resulted, as we previously mentioned, when the small plane collided with the UFO.
Y es la que colisiona con el ovni en el desierto de Coyame, se impactan en el aire.
And so that's where the collision occurred in this general area.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to hear more from Gilberto and Carlos as the story goes on. I've got the clicker. Okay, I want to give you we did a flyover. Brad was kind enough to charter a plane and take his trusty camera, and he did a flyover of where the mid-air crash happened. No, not with your wings, but in a plane. All right, here is the location, and it's rather it looks almost like a moonscape. It's once again, allí en el llano no hay mucha población. It's all ranch land, and there's rarely human habitation there on a consistent basis. All right, this is a composite photo that Brad took from the air when he was overflying the area. And it's a very rocky, hilly terrain, of course. And another view. What was it like overflying that area, Brad?
Very early in the morning, and it was very smooth. And thanks to Chase Snodgrass, he didn't charge me a dime to go up.
Okay, I'd like to work out that same arrangement with him after the conference.
I'm kind of on the waiting list. We're going to go do it again. See how it changes.
Maybe you can swoop down a little bit lower.
I'll put that on the list.
All right, so just to set the perspective on where this happened, give you a little background, give you an overview. And what's interesting is, you know, it's been interesting how Google Earth has developed over the past few years, because when we started this case, Google Earth was just getting started, and you couldn't focus down very far in this area of Mexico. But now you can almost see the lizards on the ground. So if you all have Google Earth, which is free, it's a free download, try going in this general area, looking. I had set some Google Earth markers, but over the years people have deleted them and stuff like that. So you'll have to do your own hunting for it. So Ruben and I decided to put boots on the ground, and we went out there. This is what El Llano looks like from the ground. El Llano means plain, a flat, plain area. And this is basically a view of it when we're coming down this dirt road that opens up into this vast open area. And that's El Llano. If you look at it on Google Earth, it looks kind of, the soil looks light, which makes it look kind of whitish on the satellite pictures. It's kind of a distinctive shape. So the Mexican soldiers came to this area, and they discovered, first of all, fragments of the small plane, like a Cessna, something of that style. And nearby, they discovered this silver disc.
Posiblemente salieron los finales donde se piensa que el avión destacamentó que fue el que se dirigió al rescate de los.
Gilberto's pointing out that the military, that the soldiers who showed up at the scene were very likely dispatched out of the army base in Ojinaga. They made their way, you know, there's a path through the desert that's very commonly used from Ojinaga out to where this occurred in El Llano. So the thinking is that the initial dispatch of soldiers was out of the army base in Ojinaga, which is right across the river, walking distance from downtown Presidio. As mentioned before, the disc was rather small. However, it's been pointed out to me that this size very much fits other witness testimony of the smaller objects that come out of the huge ships, which we often refer to as motherships. And so these were apparently the small scout ship variety of craft. So about 16 feet, 5 inches in diameter, 5 feet tall. And there were 2 points of interest that were noted by the soldiers. There was a 12-inch jagged hole on one end, and there was a 24-inch dent on the other end with no perforation into the hull. Here at the dent, there was what seemed to be a perforation up here. The suspicion is that what caused the deaths of the Mexican soldiers, who apparently died of asphyxiation, what caused their deaths was likely the emission of some toxic substance into the air around the crash site. That is the suspicion that we have. And we have the other story that Aliens in the Forest that Ruben and I wrote a book about, where Donald Shrum was hunting in a forest in Northern California. He was bow and arrow hunting, and he ran across this huge ship, mothership, and a smaller scout ship came out of it. And he became very frightened, as any of us would be, and went up in a tree. And so these strange beings kept him up in the tree for 12 hours. And he stood up there terrified, trying to fight them off. They attempted several times to get to him. And what's interesting is the method that they used to try to get him down from the tree is they emitted this vapor that caused the oxygen around Mr. Shrum to evaporate away and caused him to start choking for lack of air. However, since this was happening in an outdoor setting, and the the breeze would dissipate the vapor, and he was able to recover his senses when they did this. So it's interesting that asphyxiation is the suspected cause of the soldiers' deaths in this case. We know that the U.S. surveillance had significant assets along the Texas-Mexico border and still does today, and so they were keeping a close watch on what the Mexican recovery team was doing. And while the Mexicans were attempting to recover the downed object, there was a military gathering of material on the Fort Bliss base in El Paso. We know for certain that the operation did not originate at Fort Bliss, so nobody at Fort Bliss would even be knowledgeable that this was happening at the fort. They used special tactical force from another part of the U.S. came in and used Fort Bliss, which is a massive military compound, one of the largest in the world. They used Fort Bliss as a staging area because it was close to where the downed spacecraft was. So, by the way, here is a small map. Here's El Paso, and here's Albuquerque, New Mexico. And that's how massive the Fort Bliss and White Sands complex, which connect to each other, are. Here's Fort Bliss, this blue shaded area, and this is the White Sands missile range. And these are also military lands. So this is a massive property. So according to the DENIP document that describes this case, there were UH-1 Huey helicopters, which were the most common type of helicopter in the 70s, used in the Vietnam War. And there was also a large cargo helicopter, which we have discovered witnesses on the Texas side of the Rio Grande who saw the military convoy of helicopters coming back from Mexico in 1974, and they noted that one of the helicopters was a twin rotor, similar to this one, the Boeing CH-46. Although another report indicated that perhaps it was a Sikorsky Super Stallion, which looks, it has this other rotor in the back, but this one has the two large rotors. So after the soldiers from Mexico from Ojinaga, we suspect, attempted to make the recovery, what happened is they traveled just a short distance away, probably either headed back to the base in Ojinaga or headed to Chihuahua. We're not completely certain. We're completely uncertain about that. We had suspected because Chihuahua has larger military facilities, including an air base, we suspected that perhaps instead of going back to Ojinaga, they were headed to Chihuahua. That would be my suspicion, that Mexican military command would want to do that.
Just real quickly, in our research, Noe and I was looking at this particular incident. We also came across a number of other UFO crashes that occurred along the southwest, along the border of Mexico and Texas. And in the other cases, as early as 1955, and in another case in 1948 in Laredo, 1955 near Del Rio, what we found was that the Mexican military, as well as the government, was very cooperative with the U.S. authorities here, as well in terms of retrieving crashed UFOs. The other interesting fact is that in doing our research in this, what we found was with Coyame, although we don't know where the Mexican troops were going to take it, but in our research, using the DENIP report, they mentioned Atlanta, Georgia. That was one of the final destinations, which we'll go into very further.
in which I'll turn it over.
Okay, thank you, Ruben. Just once again, getting back to the original story, an interesting item, new development in the case. I'm only going to touch on this briefly because it's kind of long and involved. I've been dealing with a gentleman who posted this information for about 6 months, maybe more. You all are familiar with Wikipedia, right? The internet's free encyclopedia. And the way Wikipedia works, like other wikis, the way it works is anyone can go in and contribute information, and anyone can go in and edit information. Sometimes the information is 100% top-notch, Encyclopedia Britannica level. And other times, somebody goes in and goofs off and puts information that's totally untrustworthy. And there is a group of volunteers on Wikipedia who monitor for the goofballs and try to remove that as quickly as possible. You have to establish an account, and you have to have a few credible postings, and then they'll let you have more access. The more good work you do, you kind of earn points with them. And it's all voluntary and it's all no pay, right? So all of a sudden, about a year ago, these postings about the Coyame incident start appearing on Wikipedia. And they are posted by a gentleman who goes by the username of Mercy11. So we found that interesting, Ruben and I, because we had been studying this case since 2005 collectively, and we had never heard the data that suddenly appeared on Wikipedia, which, by the way, Mercy11, after much questioning by me, contacting him, badgering him for the original sources, he suddenly took all that information offline. You won't find it anymore. ¿Tenía un comentario? Okay, we're going to have Carlos give us some additional comment.
Aquí al respecto de lo que está señalando Noé, tuve oportunidad de hablar hace algunas semanas con un militar mexicano.
He recently spoke to a Mexican military official regarding this information that we're referring to on Wikipedia.
Y me dijo lo siguiente: mira, Carlos, seguramente que los datos que están aquí en Wikipedia no son los originales.
It's very likely that the information posted here is not the original source of this information.
Sin embargo, es muy probable, además, de que los 4 personas que se señalan ahí ahorita en el slide sean más.
It's very likely that these 4 persons mentioned as having died in the Coyame incident, actually there are more than 4. It wasn't just 4 Mexican soldiers, it was very likely more than 4.
Y por política de los militares, a este tipo de eventos y otros que tienen que ver con aspectos de seguridad nacional, se cambian totalmente los nombres.
And what happens a lot with the way Mexican national interest information is handled by the Mexican government is they will purposely alter the factual information and change people's names when they report an incident like this.
Lo que estoy tratando de investigar en este momento es, como ustedes pueden ver, están los nombres y al lado está el número que correspondería a la pertenencia del ejército.
What I'm currently involved in doing is taking this information that appears on this posting from Wikipedia and looking up, for example, the military numbers that are shown there, like B72354, for Rogelio Arguelles Gonzalez, and the other numbers. I'm trying to correlate that with actual military records, death records, and other types of records.
Entonces, lo que ahorita aparentemente podemos comprobar es que los nombres no serían los originales. El segundo paso es que ese número de serie, si realmente existieron dentro del ejército mexicano y es lo que estoy tratando de corroborar.
We're fairly certain that the names have been altered and aren't the original names. And and at the present time, I'm trying to determine if these numbers have ever been used by the Mexican military and assigned to specific individuals.
Ese número que ustedes están viendo en el slide empezó a manejarse en el ejército mexicano a fines de los años 70.
In the 1970s was the first time that these type of designations were assigned to Mexican soldiers. So the time frame is good. I mean, these military numbers were first used by the Mexican government in the 1970s.
Y ese número correspondería a la cartilla militar del servicio militar que debemos de hacer cuando cumplimos 18 años.
And these numbers correspond to the draft number that is given to every Mexican citizen in terms of making them eligible to serve in the nation's military. Gilbert has some additional comments.
Un comentario sobre el mismo listado que aparece en Wikipedia. Aunque aquí en este fragmento aparecen los soldados mexicanos, también viene el nombre de los militares norteamericanos que intervinieron en el rescate del OVNI.
As we're going to see in a moment, the Wikipedia contributions that we're talking about also give the names of some U.S. soldiers who took part in this Coyame incident.
Y aparentemente estarían todos retirados de servicio a partir del año 2000.
And apparently all of the U.S. soldiers named as having taken part in the incident had retired from the military as of the year 2000.
En el caso de los nombres de los militares mexicanos también viene una identificación del jeep o del vehículo en el que se estaban desplazando, también viene la matrícula.
Okay. And so we're also trying to track down the license registration for one of the Mexican military vehicles that's mentioned. So.
Pues habría que ver si ese documento recientemente puesto en internet tiene que ver con el primer documento de él, que surge en los años 90, 95 aproximadamente, es cuando lo...
We're trying to determine if perhaps this information that was posted on Wikipedia came from the same source or sources as the Deneb report, which first surfaced in the early 1990s, suddenly appeared on bulletin board services throughout the world, apparently from some leaked government information.
O sea, si son las mismas personas que subieron la primera información las que están dando a conocer este segundo documento.
The suspicion here is that the folks who made known the Deneb report back in the 90s are now trying to give additional information, additional clues as to what happened near Presidio in 1974. Gracias. Okay, just backing up for a moment. As you can see there, a short distance from the wreckage was also an olive green Jeep belonging to the Mexican military and containing the bodies of these 4 soldiers that are mentioned here. Their bodies displayed signs of death by asphyxiation, and they were also in possession of their firearms but showed no evidence in attempting to use them. Alright, this is in keeping with the idea that death suddenly overtook them. They were not aware of what the causal agent was, and they were not prepared for what happened to them. It's possible that something that was still venting from the crashed saucer, which they were now carrying, or perhaps it was early exposure to some toxic substance which took a while, maybe an hour, hour and a half, to actually do its work and cause their deaths. So now this was also from the Wikipedia article, and this was what Gilberto was referencing just now. He was stating that names of U.S. soldiers involved in the operation were also suddenly posted on Wikipedia. As I mentioned, I corresponded with Mercy 11, who the username of the person who posted this information. He refused to give me his personal email or any contact information. The only thing I know is that he's Hispanic, and the only UFO-related information that he has ever posted on Wikipedia, and he has posted tons of stuff, but this is the only UFO-related information that he has ever posted on Wikipedia. Who is he? We don't know. Perhaps an ex-serviceman, perhaps a family member of a serviceman, or perhaps it's not just one individual. He gave me the runaround, gave me several false leads about where the information came from, and every time I would call him on it, then he would say, okay, well, I've got to go back, and, I don't remember. It's been so long ago since I posted that. I don't know where it came from. And he kept beating around the bush and giving me cold leads. And finally, at the very end, about 2 or 3 months ago, he said, I just don't remember. I'm just going to take the information down off of Wikipedia. And he did, and I haven't heard from him since. Never found out who he is, what his background is. We suspect, based on other information we found on the internet, that he may currently reside in Puerto Rico. Okay. Area of the crash again, just to establish where all of this happened. We think Candelaria is a key, and there's Ruben and me very relaxed after last year's conference had ended, and Brad took us up to Candelaria, which is just basically a road crossing. It's a very small, nobody's here from Candelaria. I don't mean to offend anyone, but it's just a small settlement. Probably calling it a town would be a little bit of an exaggeration, but there is a bar there, right? There's a bar there? The bar. Yeah, okay. It wasn't open when we went, unfortunately, but there is a bar. So, okay, now, the reason we think Candelaria is a key, these documents that have come forward seem to indicate that the team from Fort Bliss up here in El Paso came down right along the border, staying on the U.S. side until they got to Candelaria, and then they moved in to the crash site. So it doesn't seem to me that, and to other UFO investigators, that they would have gone into Mexico up here. They wanted to minimize the amount of time that they were in the airspace of another country. They wouldn't have come down here where there are population centers and go in here and then backtrack. It seems to us that it's logical that the border crossing at Candelaria would indicate the crash site occurred in that general area. And that seems to be borne out by the eyewitness testimony of people who heard and saw things in August 1974 who were living in this area, and also the witnesses that were living in the Candelaria area. So the U.S. team came in, came across on helicopters. We had Hueys and we had a cargo helicopter, and they took over the UFO, attached it to a cargo helicopter, and basically took away the UFO, brought it back across around Candelaria. We have witnesses on the Texas side who said they saw the helicopter convoy coming back from Mexico. And at that period of time, 1974, there wasn't much air traffic, especially military air traffic, in the Candelaria area. So John Chambers and his mother, Johnny Chambers, told us this amazing story, of having seen the fireball explosion right above El Llano, and then hearing local residents talk about the helicopters coming back across from Mexico. So the UFO was removed and soldiers gathered the remaining evidence and exploded it. We think because there was a possibility of some toxic or deadly substance being released so close to the U.S. border. What was the explosive that was used to obliterate any remaining toxic substance as well as the evidence? It could have been a suitcase nuke, which was in our nation's arsenal in 1974. The suspicion is that it was either a highly concentrated group of conventional explosives or perhaps a suitcase nuke, which would have affected only a very small area, very small weapon in terms of atomic. And the suitcase nuke theory kind of received a boost last year when a legendary Texas school teacher, Johnny Chambers, came forward and said that she and her son were coming down the mountain around Rio Dosa from the hot springs. Coming down the mountain, their car was oriented, looking toward Mexico, when they saw this huge ball suddenly blossom, ball of light blossom above the mountain range in Mexico. It was just a big explosion in the sky, mostly round, Mrs. Chambers said. And I could see it in my mind, but it's hard to describe. I would say the width of it was about 4 or 5 miles, and of course it was pretty high up in the sky. Her son, who was age 10 in 1974, saw the same thing. He was in the car with her. All of a sudden, a big old glow fireball-looking thing appeared over the mountain. We stopped and watched it for a while, and it was quite a fireball. Just to set the stage here, this is approximately where the Chambers were in their vehicle, and they were looking across. Here's El Llano, here's Candelaria, Rio Dosa, and we're in Presidio today. They were looking straight across, and this is the general area where the fireball in the sky occurred. They, Mrs. Chambers said it was about, or the Chambers, both of them said it was about maybe 4 to 5 miles wide. This is the mountain range that runs between the Rio Grande River and where this happened. And this is the approximate place where the Chambers were looking into Mexico. And we went out, courtesy, Brad, I think he stepped up for a minute, but Brad, and also we went out with John Chambers to look at the exact point where they saw the fireball. And this is the vantage point. If you went out to Chinate Hot Springs and if you stood right where they were looking, this is the vantage point. Oops. Oh, sorry about that. Got ahead of myself. Alright. Okay, this is exactly the point at which they saw the explosion rising up over the mountain. And before I met the Chambers, who attended last year's event here in Presidio, and they came up and spoke about their sighting. But before that, I had put together this computer simulation using the photograph that Brad had sent me of the location and kind of photoshopping in mushroom cloud. And I remember, vividly when we showed the blown up image that we printed on a color printer to Mrs. Chambers, who's now in her 80s. And she said, "Oh my God, how did you get a picture of it?" So I was happy that the representation of what she saw must have been pretty close. She didn't see as much cloud layers in it, but generally speaking, a fireball up over the mountain range in Mexico. We watched it all the way down the mountain, she says. I imagine 5 or 10 minutes. We did not keep driving at regular speed. We slowed down and just kept watching it. So, John Chambers described it as being darker in the middle, radiating outward between orange and red. Not really fire red, blazing red, but it had a little orange in it, right in the center. Now, this was the comment that John Chambers made that I found especially striking, and that is that he described it as being almost like the sun coming back up. And the sun had already set that day. So he said it was almost like the sun coming back up. Well, I've heard that phrase used before many times, because I've read a lot of books about Hiroshima and the creation of the atomic bomb in the 40s. And this term, it was almost as though the sun was coming back up, has been used by others who have observed a nuclear blast. I thought it was significant. So it was a huge explosion. At first they thought that maybe a plane had crashed into the mountain. And once again, John Chambers told us that local residents reported seeing a convoy of U.S. military helicopters coming back from Mexico following this fireball that they saw. Within a day after the glow in the sky, several area residents observed a group of military helicopters moving into the U.S., including one large twin-rotor helicopter. It was several, maybe 3 or 4 altogether. Okay, I want to apologize in advance for the very poor audio on this little video clip I'm about to show you. Just bear with it. Last year we took John Chambers out to where he was standing when he saw the fireball. He and his mom saw the fireball. It was a very windy day and we did not have a windscreen on our microphone, so the audio is bad. But just notice, he's going to point and we're going to zoom over to where the mountain, where he saw the fireball, as you'll see him. So John, tell me, show us exactly what direction you saw this strange sight, and also describe it for us.
Well, I'm going to go down there and Torres, and at that time we go to Ruben. Back here is when we first saw a glow. It happened, the sun was going down. There's God. And I went to my mom, I go, oh, sun's coming back up. I thought the earth is soil wow, that's a big one. And it was over this whole mountain. It was a real distinct fire. It had different colors going all the way, yet purple to blue to red, yellow, orange.
And you had like one color there, and a different color on top of that.
But we couldn't see the clouds. That's why I'm pretty sure one had to be used because we couldn't see the clouds. It was sundown, so it wasn't reflecting light really well. It was pretty clouds, and it was like consistent gray.
So again, sorry you couldn't hear a lot of what he was saying, but basically he was trying to describe the colors in it and the general pattern or formation of it. So very interesting to go up there and to be at the very vantage point where they saw it that day in August 1974. Okay, so the recovery was made and the helicopter team brought the crashed UFO back into Texas, to Fort Davis, as a matter of fact, to a wooded area that was government-controlled land in 1974 near the McDonald Observatory. And that is where the object was brought back after the recovery initially. Here is the Davis Mountains. This is where the recovery was made. Candelaria, Rio Dosa, right around here. And it was brought, here's Presidio. And it was brought into the Davis Mountains area. And according to the documents, that have been mentioned, it was taken after it was brought back to Texas. It was taken by truck convoy across the country, avoiding major population centers and kind of staying on out-of-the-way routes, all the way across Texas, and eventually ended up in Atlanta, Georgia. We think, because of the fact that the Centers for Disease Control would be able to analyze and determine perhaps what toxic compound had been present that killed the Mexican soldiers, or perhaps whether there was anything lethal remaining in the wreckage. So that's why we think that that was the case. And I'm going to let Ruben talk about an interesting gentleman that contacted us saying he saw a strange being right after the crash.
Joey and I were on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. We were sharing our research on the radio interview, and this gentleman here, by the name of Mr. Tony Ramirez, he's a police officer in Southern California. He came face to face with a strange being in Coyame in a cornfield back in 1974. And in talking with him, he said that he has family, his grandparents lived in Coyame, and that during the summer, his family would go to visit the grandparents, and so he was about 12 or 13 at that time. He was riding his uncle's horse, and it got very dark, so he came back to attend he came back because it was getting too dark, so he started attending the horse. And then he said that while he was brushing the horse, he heard some strange noises coming toward him. Right across the road was a cornfield. And as he was looking out there, all of a sudden he heard this noise and then this strange looking figure. He thought it was an animal. But then when he looked at it, he said it was a small person. But it was a person with a big head. And the head would move left to right, as if the neck was very small, hard to support the head, but the eyes were red. And then he said that what he also noticed on the face of the forehead were these 3 ridges. And it frightened him so much he went running to his grandmother's and grandfather's house. And he told everybody what he saw, and his grandmother said, "Oh, he saw los diablitos. Oh, you saw the little devils." And then his grandmother said that yes, that she and his grandfather had observed seeing these little guys, these beings, up toward the edge of the field. And then there would be these bright lights in the sky. This happened in August 1974, which correlates with the UFO crash of August 1974. In addition to that, a couple of interesting developments. This particular being, or this description, was also seen by a group of witnesses in Brazil. There was a UFO crash there that occurred in 1996 in Regina, Brazil. Witnesses seen it. A rescue firefighter went to the scene, actually picked up one of the beings, took it to the hospital. Military authorities came, they closed off make sure that no information would go out. The firefighter died within several hours after holding the beam. And isn't that interesting how that correlates again with the UFO crash of Coyame in 1974? Now, what's even more interesting is Mr. Uriarte was also investigating a case where his witness saw something very similar.
Así es que, como dice Ruben, existe un caso similar al
There's a very similar case
al que él explica del policía que afirma haber visto ese humanoide en Coyame.
similar to what was seen in Coyame by the police officers.
Hay una persona en Chihuahua, Víctor Araiza,
There's a gentleman in Chihuahua named Victor Araiza
quien afirma haber sido abducido
who was also
o
abducted
raptado
or captured or kidnapped
por seres similares al que
by being
aparece
very similar like this one.
en la imagen, seres como los que se vieron en Brasil.
Very similar again to the case that happened in Brazil, in Regina, Brazil.
El testigo vive en la ciudad de Chihuahua y ahora que cuenta
The witness lives in the city of Chihuahua,
él está presentando ese otro testimonio de Coyame,
and he, again, presented this case of similar to Coyame.
por lo que da información muy interesante de que estos seres pueden estar visitando tanto el estado de Chihuahua como estas regiones de Presidio y de Ojinaga también.
It could be that these are beings very similar that are here, either in Ojinaga or other parts of Coyame as well.
Sí. Es importante informar que en Coyame hay una región de mucho reporte de avistamiento
There's a certain part in the area of Coyame where there's a lot of reported UFO sightings,
que se llama Tres Castillos.
where the area is known as Tres Castillos or Three Castles.
Los dueños de los ranchos
The owners of the ranch
afirman haber visto ovnis y no solamente verlos, sino que estos objetos están lanzando luz
that the owners have seen these strange objects shooting down beams of light,
hacia el ganado o hacia los animales de corral que hay en los
sometimes
ranchos.
toward the wandering cattle or animals that are corralled in the ranch.
Sí. También es importante comentar aquí
And it was important here, what's being commented,
de que existe un segundo caso de un objeto que se impactó en el año 1994
it could be that also there was another similar event that occurred in 1994
en el desierto de Ojinaga,
in the desert of Okinawa,
cerca del cañón del Peguis,
very close to the canyon, or the Peguis Canyon. Both Noe and I have been there.
en donde también hubo intervención militar, según testimonios de periodistas que viven en la ciudad de Ojinaga.
It was reported that military authorities have gone to the crash site, and this was reported by reporters from journalists from the city of Ojinaga.
Y es importante seguir investigando estos casos que de alguna manera están relacionados con el caso Coyame del 74.
And it's very important to continue to investigate these cases because perhaps there's a relationship with what happened to the 1974 case of Coyame.
Gracias, Gilberto. There's no way we could have written our 2 books about this case without the assistance of Gilberto and Carlos and other wonderful investigators from Mexico. As I mentioned earlier, we're doing the U.S. side of this, and they're doing the Mexican side. So it really takes a joint effort. Also reported by our good friend Bob Dean, and who helped us with our first book, Mexico's Roswell. And this is a picture that's been out in the public for some time. And Bob Dean says that he obtained this photograph while attending a conference in Mexico City in the early 80s. It was given to him by a Mexican police officer who came up to him and stated to him that this gray alien in this picture had been recovered from the crash of a UFO along the Texas-Mexico border. We don't know if this was a 74 crash near Presidio or another crash, but we do know that this is another interesting little bit of the jigsaw puzzle. We're just going to briefly summarize what our field investigation in Mexico has resulted, and then we're going to wrap it up here in just a few moments. Here's a satellite overview again. We are today in Presidio. This is a small town of Coyame. We suspect that the mid-air collision happened here, and the recovery of the object had to have been not far from the initial mid-air collision site. Small town of Coyame. We heard a wonderful presentation this morning from Dr. Javier Morales, who is now an optometrist in Odessa. How many of you all listened to this morning's presentation? Okay, a few early birds. And he has done research, and he himself is convinced that the 1974 UFO airplane collision, it was a real event, based on interviewing hundreds of persons, independently of us. He's not a UFO researcher. He's a historian who has done extensive genealogies of the families in the Coyame area. And he just stumbled upon this incident, which he had never heard about, from talking to the folks. And he told me before he had to leave for a family function a while ago, but before he left, he told me, you know, I need to show you the records that I took down from talking to all the people in Coyame, because nearly every one of them mentioned this incident in 1974. So anyway, he included a chapter in his book on the history of Coyame and the genealogy of the families of Coyame. He included a chapter on UFOs because they are such a prevalent topic in Coyame. This is during our visit to the crash site. We stopped in at the small town and we talked to the townspeople. And this is the Peguas Canyon, which Ruben mentioned a while ago. And Gilberto was talking about how there was a recorded UFO incident near the Peguas Canyon that involved the presence of Mexican military. And then this is the road that goes, branches out into the desert, north from the small town of Coyame. And you really have to go 50 or 60 miles into the desert before you get to where the events we're talking about today happen. So they didn't happen in downtown Coyame, okay? After the History Channel report came out that Ruben was involved in, we had the media of Mexico and the U.S. descend upon the village of Coyame. And they would sit in the town square and tell them, did you see the crash that happened in 1974? And of course, a lot of the people did not, because it didn't happen there in the town. It's like the Roswell incident. The Roswell incident, the confirmed debris field find of the Roswell incident is 100 miles away from Roswell. It's called the Roswell incident because Roswell was the closest major town, and it was where the debris was brought after the crash. So, I mean, the names that are associated with these incidents don't necessarily represent where the incident actually happened. So we found a site that we can only label as mysterious, unexplained. We call the airplane debris field. And we found pieces scattered over maybe a quarter of a mile alongside this road that leads out into the desert. Big pieces of the plane, the rudder, the wings, the flaps, parts of the instrument panel. We brought a few that we'll have on display at our table that we were able to smuggle out. And we kind of gathered all this. We had to convince the local people who were with us, serving as our guides, not to take these away, because they're very valuable there. They can be sold for scrap metal and they can make money. And they did take some of the pieces, but we managed to wrestle a few away from them. And when we did the UFO Hunters, I'm going to show you just a short segment where it talks about the finding of the airplane crash site.
You have the possible collision between UFO and small plane. Ruben said that he can probably get us to, because he thinks he's found an actual crash site.
If there's an alleged UFO collision with the private aircraft, we might actually find samples or artifacts from the plane and or the unidentified object.
Has the team found a crash site
Looks like something over here, Bill.
of Mexico's Roswell?
You find it? Yeah, something here. No way.
Let's get inside.
Right? You got it.
Looks like probably that way.
Man, it's amazing how
Nolan Torres co-authored the book Mexico's Roswell with Ruben Uriarte. The two men visited this site extensively while researching their book.
Ruben and Millie going down to find wreckage.
The team is searching a 1 mile by 1 mile area, hoping to find evidence of a UFO collision.
You guys see anything?
We've got 4 issues. Where is it? Whether it's been rolled by wind over the year and rain, and whether the sites have been completely scavenged by local people looking for artifacts.
Say another kilometer and a half up. Meaning we have to go that way.
Looks like something over here.
Where is it? No,
Right over here. There's that all over the book. You find it?
it's over here.
The team has located part of the wreckage, much of which may not have been seen for over 34 years.
The whole rudder assembly. Look at the little casing over there. Look at the glass, windshield.
The debris field covers approximately 10,000 square feet. The team has located wreckage at several points, including what appears to be the rudder assembly of a plane.
Well, we've discovered wreckage of a plane that's strewn out here in the desert. It could be the plane that crashed with the UFO. I can't really know that until we analyze this and find something anomalous on it, maybe some kind of radioactivity or something that would give us a clue that maybe there was some contact with the UFO.
There must be things all around your path. So what do you think?
I'm excited that we finally have something hard and tangible to work with. I mean, it's one thing to read about UFO crashes in a book and say, well, okay, maybe this happened. But when you finally get out of here and you see that there's actually something to work with, we've actually got metal to analyze and we've got soil to sample, it's exciting. This is what ufologists want. For answers, this is where you want to be. You want to be actually in the field with your hands on some artifacts that may indicate that we've had extraterrestrial contact.
Really, it's right there in the sand. There is the record. There is the clue that something happened here. Where you said it should be.
Right now, the trick is going to be working with this debris and seeing if we can get some kind of story of what actually happened. Well, this crash occurred over 3 decades ago, correct?
Yes.
And this guy's wondering
If there's anything left at all.
my thought is that this site was scrubbed pretty clean by the group that scrubbed, whether it was the Mexican military 33 years ago, whether it was the U.S. military, we don't know, but the site was scrubbed pretty clean, but we found enough pieces that we can identify.
We have a really interesting piece over here, guys. Looks like part of the hydraulics.
That's it. This is a hydraulic connector right here. So you've got a line coming in, right? And you've got various pressure belts on it. We found a piece of the tail section, we found a fuse filter, there's hydraulic lines, windshield, it's not a motor vehicle, it's not a motorcycle, it's a bike. The trick is going to be what are the analysis of the records tell us about what the plane? I mean, we know the plane record. We see windshield, we see parts of the plane, we see the balloon.
So I'm going to stop it there because our time is rapidly going. But it was an interesting find. We cannot conclusively say that this was the actual plane that collided with the UFO, but it was an interesting find. Also, some of the research that the History Channel did with the pieces that we recovered there determined that there were some substances embedded together in the, we found bits of the aluminum skin from the plane that had melted and then reformed, and there were pieces of some substances in there that could not be identified, trace elements that did not show up on the spectrum as being a particular kind of known element. So that was interesting also. There was another site that we went to with the History Channel team, which was a pit. It was near the scene of the airplane crash, and it was basically a squarish looking, you could call it a mine entrance, a vertical mine shaft is what it looked like. And there were timbers around it, so it had been made, man-made. Its purpose was totally unknown. The local residents who keep up with everything that goes on around them, it's their survival to know what everybody's doing at all times. They know nothing about this site or what its purpose was. There was barbed wire all around it at one time, and the Mexican military had come in and told the townspeople, do not go there. There is great danger. If you get near this pit, we cannot guarantee your safety. So the townspeople did not know exactly what the history of this was. There's a circle of charred earth all around this hole in the ground, and you can see it from Google Earth. You know, it's a dark circle on Google Earth. In fact, here is a Google Earth image that I captured. And of course, Google keeps updating their imagery, and sometimes on some of their updates it's not as obvious. But this is one that I took a few years back when our first book came out. And you can see right there, this is the darkened earth surrounding this pit, located north of Coyame. So what's in there? It was very interesting. One of the UFO researchers with the History Channel crew stuck a Geiger counter down in there. And around the site, radiation was minimal, mainly background. When he stuck the Geiger counter down in there, the needle started to spike. So there was increased radiation down in the hole. And Ruben and I actually wrote an article that appeared in the nation's leading UFO magazine, UFO magazine, published by Bill Burns. Our article, well, this is not the title we gave it, but this is what the magazine editors gave it. What's inside this hole? That's an intriguing title. So we have a segment on the History Channel about that as well. So to close the session then, we're going to talk about some late developments and that were sent to us by Carlos Guzman, who will be back in just a moment, and Alfonso Salazar, who is Carlos's right-hand man. And they have determined from doing research that the Mexican Army commander for the zone that includes Coyame and Ojinaga was suddenly replaced, transferred unexpectedly, according to the newspaper articles, on September 14, 1974. What's significant about that date is that it was just 3 weeks after the Coyame incident. Now, the Mexican researchers feel that the Coyame incident was bungled. The Mexican soldiers' involvement in the Coyame incident was a great mistake, the way they attempted to handle things. They were not equipped to make this recovery, and they stumbled onto something that was beyond their ability to contain and to control. And so perhaps this was the reason that there had been no change in leadership for the Mexican Army zone that includes Coyame, and then suddenly 3 weeks after August 1974, the commander was suddenly reassigned and given a lesser post in the government. I'm going to have Carlos speak just briefly about this. Carlos, queremos que nos digas un poco del comandante que fue transferido de repentemente después del incidente.
Bueno, sí. Dentro de los soldados, dentro de la que recobraron en ese tiempo el objeto, al comandante lo transfirieron de región. Pues hay una región militar que es Ojinaga.
The region of Ojinaga, the commander who would have been in charge of those troops sent out to recover the UFO was suddenly transferred.
Y esta noticia la encontramos por accidente.
We found this by accident while doing research on events that were possibly related to the Coyame incident.
En los periódicos de aquella época.
We were looking at newspapers from that date range.
Entonces son esas notas que juntándolas podemos armar un rompecabezas, pero nos resulta muy curioso, muy interesante.
Although it's like putting pieces together of a jigsaw puzzle, which may or may not be related in some cases, what is interesting is how all these things do seem to fit together and present an interesting picture of what might have happened.
Que salga esa noticia haciendo referencia al encargado de la zona militar hacia otro lado.
It's very interesting that they would have a switch of commanders. The top commander in the Mexican military for Coyame and Ojinaga occurred 3 weeks after the Coyame incident. Gracias, Carlos. Another interesting relation to this case possibly is that suddenly, 5 days after the Coyame incident, suddenly President of the United States, Gerald Ford, urgently requested a meeting with Mexican President Luis Echeverria within 5 days. And the meeting ended up, because of their various previous schedules and so forth, it ended up not being held until October 21. But still, that was less than 2 months after the Coyame incident. So why the urgency to suddenly have a meeting of the two heads of state who had never met before, by the way? Why would that occur? Carlos.
Esa es otra de las notas curiosas en donde tratamos de investigar a través de los periódicos antiguos cómo y qué pasó en la conformación de un medio ambiente.
Our intent here was to do research on what was going on politically in the two countries that could be related to the Coyame incident in August 1974 and dates near that.
Y sobre todo que nos causó interés y sorpresa, como ustedes pueden ver ahí en el slide, el que el gobierno de Estados Unidos haya requerido, pedido al gobierno mexicano una reunión.
What really strikes us is that suddenly, out of the blue seemingly, President Ford's people contacted President Echeverria's people and requested this meeting all of a sudden. Just shortly after the Coyame incident. Gracias, Carlos. Another interesting item that was found by their research was that a large number of Mexican soldiers were reportedly killed in a traffic accident. Very few details given, and it happened around the same time frame. So we know Mexican soldiers died in the Coyame incident, but it may have been reported as something else, such as a traffic accident. And we're going to have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, our time has basically expired, but just quickly, there was a reported death of a Mexican airplane pilot around the same time period, August 30th, 1974. It was reported that his small plane had crashed. Could this pilot's death have been related to the Coyame incident? Also, now this really piqued my interest, having always been a big fan of the space program, both U.S. and Russia, that suddenly, 3 days after the Coyame incident, the Russians suddenly scrubbed their Soyuz mission, which was up in the air, up in space at that time, and the two cosmonauts did an emergency return to Earth that almost resulted in their deaths. So another little intriguing piece of possibly what was going on that was affecting the countries. And that concludes our presentation. I want to thank everybody for your kind attention and for all the support that you've given us over the years. We don't want to bump into Lloyd's presentation, but we can take a couple of quick questions, maybe, sir.
Did anybody hear an explosion from the fireball?
There were several reports. We found several gentlemen who are ranchers in the area of the impact site who reported a earth-shattering explosion. All the windows in the small ranch house out there were shattered, and we feel that was related. Other incidents were reported where a crash occurred. One more question, Chris.
Did you happen to do any research to find out if there were any prior plane crashes in the alleged area of this crash?
Yes, we have, as Dr. Javier this morning, Morales, he talked about other plane crashes that have occurred in the Coyame area, some of which were drug trafficking activity planes, drug smuggling planes, but all the residents distinctly remember 1974 as being something unique and different and unexplainable. So the 1974 event is firmly lodged in the minds of Coyame residents. We thank you all again, and we have our book available, and we hope to see you throughout the rest of the conference. Lloyd Pye and the Star Trial Skull, the most fascinating story that you've heard, in case you've never heard it, and also Travis Walton, Fire in the Sky, coming up next.